just here. Hi, everybody. This is some work that I have been doing with my advisor, Dennis Hartmann, and Rob Wood, Dan Grosvenor, who's now at University of Leeds. And while working on this, we've been working with some nice folks at the national labs. They're Susanna Burrows, Phil Rasch, Paula and Ma, and Scott Elliott. And actually, we met Susanna at last year's AGU, so it's very nice to be able to present this work this year. Today I'll be talking about how sulfate and the organic enrichment in sea spray aerosols explain some of the space-time patterns in Southern Ocean cloud droplet number concentration, or ND. And some motivation to this, although it's discussed a little before now, is provided by our 2014 paper, which is a roundup of remote sensing in the Southern Ocean. And one of the really robust features that we found was a minima in cloud droplet effective radius in summer. And that's what this plot is showing here. Summer in Southern Ocean is here, and all the different lines correspond to different ways that MODIS can detect the cloud droplet effective radius. So this is the sort of standard collection 5.1 product, and the different colored lines correspond to the different retrieval bands. As you can see, and across all of these, there's a really robust minimum. And so what we did in that paper is we threw everything in the hopper and calculated how much of an impact this made on the upwelling shortwave in this region. So just by having that seasonal cycle, the upwelling shortwave is enhanced by at least 8 watts per meter squared in the summer. And so basically you have smaller droplets and you get more upwelling shortwave. And indeed, there's some discussion in the literature about how this is potentially a biogenic influence, since there's not a lot of other aerosol sources, and it is indeed the summer when biology might be a bit stronger. And sort of the flow chart for how this would work could be seen in this way. So on the left, you have phytoplankton here, and they're nice and green so you can see them from space, and there's a lot of different kinds of critters there. And so this is the primary emission pathway, which I'll talk about first. And the phytoplankton have a life cycle. They are predated upon by zooplankton, and the zooplankton predation is not very efficient. It's termed sloppy foraging, or sloppy grazing, which I was amused to find when I first started researching this isn't just a way of describing how I eat with chopsticks. And so there's some residual organic macromolecules that then go on to enrich the sea spray aerosol. And the notion here is that the enriched sea spray aerosol has a higher CCN activity and more efficiently nucleates cloud droplets. And so the secondary aerosol, or the secondary emission pathway is shown here. And so you have dimethyl sulfide, and this is sort of the more familiar pathway. It's the one that underlines the CLA hypothesis. And you have dimethyl sulfide, which is emitted by phytoplankton, especially coccolithophores, shown here. And it is oxidized to sulfate, which acts efficiently as a CCN. And so that too would potentially be nucleating more cloud droplets. And so here, the temptation, of course, would be to just correlate the measurements of ocean chlorophyll, which you can see from space, as we saw in the title slide, with the detected cloud properties. And we argue here that this isn't an entirely appropriate thing to do. There is actually a time lag that happens between the ocean color, the chlorophyll, and the actual change in the chemical properties of the primary sea spray emissions. And this is shown in Burrows 2014, which is a poster for this morning. And the dimethyl sulfide to sulfate is somewhat dependent on photochemistry, and so that's going to be modulated by the presence or absence of the sun. And so at the end of the day, we argue that really the best you're going to hope for from the existing remote sensing in this region is a spatial correlation to appear between ocean productivity and cloud properties. And so just a quick aside, for the rest of the talk, I'll use cloud droplet number concentration, which is ND, and this is sort of more closely related to the CCN. And if you don't do a lot of cloud physics, more CCN gives you smaller droplets, the smaller effective radius, and a larger ND. So with that said, in addition to the issue of the sort of non-trivial relation between biological productivity and cloud properties, there's also some pretty significant issues with the remote sensing in this region. And this is shown very nicely in Dan and Rob's 2014 paper. So this basically, the passive remote sensing has trouble effectively retrieving the cloud properties. So with increasing solar zenith angle here, and the sun, therefore, the sun is lower on the horizon, the retrieved cloud droplet number concentration kind of blows up. And so this too then makes the retrieval a function of latitude and time of the year. And so looking at the spatial correlation, this is shown here with cloud droplet number concentration, and the region is 35 to 55 south. And cloud droplet number concentration is on the y-axis, and the chlorophyll from sea-whiffs, cloud droplet number concentration is from MODIS, by the way. Chlorophylls from sea-whiffs is on the x-axis. As you can see, things generally sort of go together. So first, we look at the uncorrected cloud droplet effect, the uncorrected ND, and this is every year, 2001, 2009. We don't make any corrections for solar zenith angle, and we correlate it with the sea-whiffs chlorophyll, and you get a rank correlation of 0.57. If we look at the ND corrected for 2007, so Dan reprocessed all of the level 2 swath data and calculated a ND with no bias due to solar zenith, or a little less bias due to solar zenith angle, and comparing that to the sort of climatology of where the ocean is productive. So this is average chlorophyll from 2001 to 2009. You can see the rank correlation improves a little bit. However, if you look at the correlation for the 2007 cloud droplet number concentration versus the 2007 productivity, so the correct year to be looking at, then the rank correlation is quite good, it's 0.76. And so this is indicative of a couple of things. One, that there is some sort of spatial correlation between these properties, and two, that it is sensitive to the interannual variability. And this sort of makes sense. While in general, certain regions will experience chlorophyll blooms very regularly and be very productive, the strength and location of these chlorophyll blooms does vary from year to year. So this is, while very suggestive, this is very suggestive of some sort of effect, some sort of linkage between the biological productivity and the cloud properties. And so carrying on from this, we decided to look at the space-time correlation between cloud properties and various candidate CCN predictor variables. And so what we do is we average the data into 5 by 15 degree boxes across the region 35 to 55 south, and we use a monthly resolution. And then we do multiple linear regression on the measured MODIS cloud droplet number concentration, and we fit it to various predictor variables and combinations of predictor variables. The candidate predictor variables are wind, sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, dimethyl sulfide, the organic enrichment of sea spray, sulfate, and sea salt. The data used here is from observations where those are available. However, for sulfate and sea salt, we're using the Aerocom phase 1 data. And the organic enrichment is derived from the physical framework of Burrows 2014. And this uses the Popbeck ocean biogeochemistry model for an arbitrary year as input. And sorry for showing a plot in this presentation, but basically, this is the R squared between these various predictor variables and the cloud droplet number concentration from MODIS for 2007. And basically, the upshot of this is that the organic enrichment and the sulfate do quite well at predicting this, and they do quite a bit better than sort of some other common candidate predictor variables at predicting the variance again. The other thing I'd like to point out is that this is the MODIS this is the variance predicted by these same predictor variables when the uncorrected MODIS and cloud droplet number concentration is used. And you can see it never really climbs too much above 30%. So that's probably somewhat hobbling being able to see this impact from these predictors. And so it's interesting to see what the predicted ND is from these the model sulfate and the model enrichment. And so the observed ND from 2007 is shown here, and the modeled ND is shown here. And you can see that there's some regions that have pretty significant similarities. They get sort of the big picture right, of course. The modeled ND is quite a bit smoother. And since this is a multiple linear regression, we can evaluate what the contributions are from the individual predictor variables. And the sulfate contribution is quite strong, although note that these are different color bars. And it's more localized to lower latitudes. And this is consistent in some respects with the differing ocean biology in these regions and more prevalent insulation. The contribution from organic enrichment is shown here, and it's, as you can see, it's quite a bit stronger over regions of high primary productivity, which is also pretty interesting. And so you might say, well, what's the impact of this on the upwelling shortwave? And it's actually pretty significant. We calculated it a couple of ways. We took the technique that is used in Mesquitza and Nenes, 2006, which uses a bunch of observed cloud properties and calculates the impact on upwelling shortwave. And so we just took out the, regressed out the change in ND that would be due to sulfate into organic enrichment, and it is shown here in the colors on a zonal month plot. And we also used offline radiative transfer from CAM using CAM's clouds. And this offers pretty robustly an enhancement in upwelling shortwave in excess of 10 watts per meter squared. The CAM data is shown with these dashed white lines. And in the annual, this is a really hard angle, the annual mean is between 1 and 6 watts per meter squared when you average over the entire year. And so it's definitely a pretty significant contribution to the upwelling shortwave. And so just to wrap up here, our conclusions are that, one, the observed chlorophyll and ND agree spatially pretty well. The modeled candidate CCM predictive variables we have consisting of sulfate and the organic enriched sea spray aerosol predict observed ND to some extent. Lastly, that the changed ND is calculated from these enhancements to significantly enhance the reflected shortwave by 1 to 6 watts per meter over the Southern Ocean. So these are my acknowledgments and people I'd like to thank, and I'd love to take any of your questions.
Any questions for our speaker?
Okay.
Perhaps before you go, you could, at least for me, comment. You mentioned the importance of using this MODIS corrected data set.
Yeah.
What's involved in this correction?
I think Dan would better be able to answer that. I believe the most important element of that, is that, and the details of this are in Grosvenor in 2014, but the most important element of this is removing the retrievals at which the solar zenith angle exceeds 65 degrees. Because as you can see, it begins to have quite a pronounced bias in the cloud droplet number concentration. I don't know if there's other filtering, or that's okay? Okay.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.